It's great to be with you tonight, and I'm excited about this. I've been involved in our Indigenous committee for, I guess it's almost a year, and Tim has sat on that committee with us, along with some other great people. So we just felt it would be important to help all the Rotarians understand the culture, the traditions, and so on with our Indigenous neighbors. And so we're very pleased to have Tim here with us tonight. So I want to introduce Tim. Tim is a proud member of the Blackfoot Confederacy for the Kainai Blood Reserve. Tim is the Vice President of Indigenous Relations and Equity Strategy with the Calgary Foundation, where he hopes to strengthen, enhance, and shift the culture and practice at the foundation while incorporating work of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and equity, both internally and in the broader community. Tim facilitates Indigenous men's domestic violence groups in the Calgary Correctional Center, is chair of the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, and is a proud father of a 9-year-old daughter. So Tim, go ahead. We're excited to have you here.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And yeah, I'm also excited to be here. I'm excited to share space and hold space and share insights on the work of reconciliation and decolonization anytime that I'm invited to. So I appreciate the invitation. And just by way of a deeper introduction, I'll just say, I just shared with you a Blackfoot name that was gifted to me as an infant by an elder in my community of the Blood Reserve. I was raised there. I was raised on the Blood Reserve. My family comes from the Acknowledgement clan. In English, that translates to the Many Children's Clan. And yeah, thanks again for inviting me. My focus tonight is going to be centered around land acknowledgement. I'm going to be providing some context behind what I believe is important and crucial when entities and systems are trying to incorporate the work of reconciliation into their system and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, I think overall, in general, across the country, there is a huge interest for many Canadians to begin to mobilize the work of reconciliation. And with that, we are hearing land acknowledgements happening a lot these days. For me, that's a really exciting thing. My fear is that land acknowledgements are going to become so repetitive that they're going to lose meaning. And there are still attitudes and beliefs that exist in our society by dominant narratives, by those with settler descent, who have a very negative view of Indigenous people. Many of you may have been raised with that view of who we are in our communities. And you're probably really aware of the deficit statistics that exist for Indigenous people in this country. You know, deficit statistics around high numbers of Indigenous children in care, high numbers of Indigenous people in the justice system, historically low graduation rates, substance abuse. All of these deficits we know. It's a good thing to know them, but I'm more interested in taking folks through deeper levels of understanding behind why those deficit statistics exist in the first place. I'm also all about the facts. So everything that I have designed is all factual information. The fact of the matter is that 100% of land in North America, that's Canada and the United States, is located on traditional ancestral land. So wherever your homes are, wherever you frequently visit in Canada or the United States, is located on occupied land. That's the fact of the matter. The other fact is the Indigenous population is the fastest growing segment of the population. And there's a statistic from 2006, and although it's an old statistic, the trend is the same, that we're seeing this young population of Indigenous people growing. And that should tell us a couple of things. It should tell us that we have to prepare ourselves for this growth. And I know that many Rotary clubs have a large interest in recruiting Indigenous members into your clubs, in supporting Indigenous specific projects in First Nations communities. And while all of those intentions are really good, I still feel like there's a huge level of context missing behind all of these motivations and these intentions. So I'm going to take you through a snapshot of what that means specific to land acknowledgement this evening. And I'm going to be going back and forth between a PowerPoint slide deck, and there is a video clip, a couple of video clips that I'll also share with you tonight. And like Steve and Brian had mentioned at the beginning, I'll leave some time for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box, or there's a Q&A chat box there as well. And we will try to, I'm not going to promise that I will have all the solutions. I'm one person. There is no sort of set of knowledge for all of this. I'm very much on my own learning journey, and the difference between what I'm doing is I'm trying to mobilize this knowledge that I'm gaining through all of this work. So we'll just get started here. There we go. So this is sort of just a flow of time. We have begun to incorporate these principles that we call brave space. I believe that we are so used to language around holders of space, so facilitators referring to safe space. And I sort of struggle with that because I'm not sure that it is entirely possible to create safe space. As a facilitator of this conversation, I can tell all of you guys, you know what, guys, I'm going to create a safe space here. But that safety is only to the standards of who I am and how I'm holding on to this space. That doesn't mean that the participants on this call or viewing this webinar are going to be completely safe or comfortable in asking some of those really challenging, difficult questions that often comes with this work. So instead, we're asking you to show up with levels of bravery. Showing up in brave spaces invites levels of curiosity. It invites levels of vulnerability. I often make myself really vulnerable in these spaces that I hold. I share personal things that are happening real time in my life. I share some of the impacts of intergenerational trauma that I'm experiencing often. So I'm showing up with lots of vulnerability and bravery. And I would just ask that you sort of do the same thing. And so I'll just really quickly read through these principles that foster brave space to hopefully help set the tone for the next 90 minutes that we have together, and for all of you, for all of your clubs moving forward. So the first one is we are present in this virtual space and with each other. We're together for a really short period of time, and I'm just asking for your undivided attention. It's very easy in this virtual time to be distracted, to check text messages coming in or respond to emails. And so I'm just asking for your full undivided attention for this very small, short amount of time that we have together. We are open to new ideas, ways of thinking, and feedback. I think that's pretty straightforward. We listen deeply and seek new knowledge and understanding. I think that many of our organizations, many of these mainstream systems that we're a part of, like Rotary clubs, like the Calgary Foundation, have been founded on a dominant narrative, have been founded on a culture that we have normalized, and that's typically based on Western practices from settler ideologies and all this kind of stuff. And a big part of the work of reconciliation and decolonization is not necessarily giving up those systemic ways of how we function as systems, but it's about making room for new ways of understanding. When that apology was delivered by the Prime Minister in June of 2008 to residential school survivors, that was a very public apology. What was problematic about that was the next day after that apology happened, You had citizens of this country being angry because they had their leader apologizing to a group of people, and they had no idea why he was apologizing in the first place. So there was a level of knowledge that was missing. There's this truth telling that still doesn't exist in a lot of our spaces, in a lot of our organizations, and within a lot of our systems. So we're just asking you to be open to some of these new ways of understanding. We are curious, we are curious and hold a willingness to have our minds changed. I feel like, sorry, just need to recenter myself here, it threw me off. So we're just asking for levels of curiosity, and that there is a dominant culture that exists in all of our systems, in all of our spaces. A lot of that is based off of Western paradigms of thought and practice, of settler colonial perspectives, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's really hard, and it's a challenge for those of us who are put in these positions to really shift change, because you have a certain way of doing things. And I've been to Rotary Club meetings where it's very structured. There's lots of things happening, but with this work, we're asking for levels of openness to make room for other ways of understanding. And I know through the conversations that Steve is having at his club that they're exploring the possibility of including other elements, other Indigenous paradigms of thought and practice into how clubs function. We bring awareness to our biases, assumptions, and judgments. We, at the Calgary Foundation, we host this event every year. It's called Vital City. At the most recent Vital City event we had some really powerful women on the panel, all of color, racialized women, Black, Indigenous, and a person of color. One of them, Elise and Cora, talked about biases. And she says, if you have a brain, you have a bias. We all have them. And with the information that I'm going to be sharing with you, sometimes those biases tend to show up. We're just asking that you be really aware of when you notice them coming and surfacing for you, just bring awareness to them. We hold a space of trust and confidentiality. We focus on possibility and see obstacles as opportunities for learning. We hold brave space for courageous conversations. We challenge ideas and not people. In a lot of the things that we're designing around impacts of intergenerational trauma or decolonizing practices, I'm often encouraging participants to begin to mobilize the knowledge that they are gaining by sharing it from an individual perspective. And some of the concerns that surface, especially from those participants with settler backgrounds, is, well, you know what, Tim, I'm at the dinner table and I'm trying to have this conversation with my older father or grandfather, and they are just not willing to hear it. They are holding on to a narrative and a history that they have come to really believe in and be patriotic about. And the moment we begin to surface truths about that history, defense mechanisms begin to surface. And my advice to them in those spaces is, it's not your job to change the mind of those, mindsets that are stuck in a generational way of thinking. But it is your job to provide them with the truth. What they do with that truth is up to them. It's too hard on a person to walk into a space, into a conversation, trying to change a person's mind that's just not ready to change. And so I lean on this principle of challenging ideas and not people. The last thing I want to do is encourage or have family connections break down because of this new way of understanding that we're getting into. I do want some truth to happen, though. I want to hold some power to the truth, because for far too long has the truth of where we came from and where your ancestors have come from and where the impact that they have had on my ancestors has been swept under the rug. And I think we're entering a new time, a new way of leadership that's surfacing that really hard truth for change and well-being for all rather than only a few. We allow discomfort to lead our growth. It's not a comfortable thing for me to, be holding onto this space and to have so many people I don't really know, so many people of different cultural backgrounds, be so focused on the words that I'm saying. I'm feeling a lot of pressure. I'm not feeling all that confident, but I know that this is important. This is an important conversation. I'm put in this place for a reason. And so I'm here. I'm allowing my discomfort to lead my growth, hopefully to translate into some of the things, the progressive things that Rotary clubs are doing. Take accountability for your own learning. This is the difference between knowledge extraction and knowledge mobilization. So historically, Indigenous people have always been extracted from. We have been extracted from inland by displacement, putting us on reserves. We have been extracted from in resources, natural resources. We have and continue to be extracted from in our children that were forcibly removed from our communities to attend residential schools in an effort to assimilate us into the dominant culture, into the dominant white European culture. And it's just take. In this contemporary time, it's showing up as knowledge extraction. So if you are attending this space tonight, only with the motivation to increase your own understanding, you're being just as extractive as, settler ancestors before you. If you are attending tonight with the intention to increase your understanding, and then to also mobilize it within your own spheres of influence related to yourself as an individual, to your families, to the systems, the workplaces, and all of these other areas that you're involved in, then you're doing something about it. You're mobilizing it. And that's being less extractive. I'm all about learning and unlearning and growth, but more importantly, I'm about transformation. And I can confidently say that the work we're doing at the Calgary Foundation is very transformative. I'm seeing it show up at individual levels in my colleagues that I work alongside, that is then translating into their roles and with the donors that they interact with, to the granting processes that they're implementing, to the communications plans and the decolonization of their timelines. Like, I'm seeing all of this stuff happen, all of these shifts occur. And we talk often, constantly about these transformations that they are experiencing at an individual level. So like I said, I feel so grateful for this work that I'm doing, specifically in this organization, because there's a level of openness and humbleness in the people that I work with, where they are actually moving some of this stuff forward. I'm going to skip that there. In 2017, I attended a presentation by Leroy Littlebear. Leroy Littlebear is an academic from my community. He's also an elder, a knowledge keeper from the Blood Reserve. And in 2017, this country was getting ready to celebrate 150 years of Confederation. In that year, it was a point of contention for many Indigenous people in this country because we didn't feel like we had a reason to celebrate. We knew that there was a story that was missing within the last 150 years. And furthermore, we recognized that our people have been here for thousands upon thousands of years. And why were we only celebrating and telling the story of the last 150 years that has been very damaging on Indigenous nations all across Canada and the United States? So I was a little taken back that Leroy was this ambassador for Canada 150, and I attended his presentation, and he talked about that. He said that organizers for Canada 150 reached out to him and asked him to be this ambassador. And he told them, if I'm going to be this ambassador, I'm going to use that platform to tell that missing story, that missing narrative about the genocide and oppression that Indigenous people have been facing. And so he went on to explain that the way societies and nations are built and formed are supposed to come from the values and customs and beliefs of the people of that land. That's how we develop national anthems. That's how we develop symbols that represent those nations. So when you think about Canada, the Canadian national anthem, you know, symbols of the Canadian flag and all of these other things that represent this country, none of that comes from the values, customs, and beliefs of the original people of this land. And for this territory, the Six of Gates at the Bee, the Blackfoot Confederacy and Treaty 7, you know, so there's this big missing narrative. And I really like this quote that I'm just gonna read out loud that Leroy said in his presentation, that every society in one way or another lays claim to a territory. Within that claimed territory, a culture arises from the mutual relationship with the land. It is through this mutual relationship with the land that cultural icons, symbols, images, values, customs, ceremonies, stories, songs, and beliefs of the people are developed. These in turn are embodied into the very being of the people. So, you know, Canada, we are built off of this belief system of a dominant culture and a dominant narrative that often, too often, ignores that there were original stewards of these lands. And I reflect on my time as, you know, going to school as a young child. I was bused from the reserve to go to Cardston Elementary School. And so I went, my parents intentionally chose not to send me to the reserve school. Little did I know that the residential schools were still operating at that time. I had no idea about them. And they, based on their horrible experiences there, they chose to bus me into, you know, the nearest urban school, which I attended. And I learned about First Nations people and Indigenous people, but it wasn't people of the Blackfoot Confederacy. It was people on the East Coast. And I was learning about like wigwams, and I could not relate to any of that kind of stuff because we were sort of treated as one homogeneous group with one set of beliefs, with zero diversity, and sort of just blanketed over. There was this story that Canada was trying to tell about who we are and all this kind of stuff that was missing the mark on our diversity. And so I just reflect on that. We know that land acknowledgements have always been a part of our communities. It's like the slide says, it's a traditional custom for Indigenous people that dates back centuries, probably since time immemorial. So time immemorial just, you know, means the beginning of time for us, that we always acknowledge who our clans were, that would identify which bioregion we belong to. So before provinces existed the way they do and how our borders exist the way they do, we had bioregions that told a lot about the people. We also believe that land acknowledgement is an important step for reconciliation, but it's more than reading off of a script. It's more than trying to get the pronunciation of these communities right. There's a lot more work involved into land acknowledgements. And if you are an organization or a person who feels obligated to read off of a script and get the pronunciation of communities, you probably haven't done enough work quite yet to get to the point. It's almost like earned knowledge. If you haven't earned the relationship with those people you are acknowledging, I would sooner say it's okay not to even do land acknowledgements. I'd rather you do that hard work of strengthening your relationship with the original stewards of the lands that you're acknowledging first. Find out about them. We're here. We're not a part of history. We're still here. We're We're trying to survive, we're trying to thrive in a world that continues to present challenge after challenge through oppression and loss. We're still trying to push through and survive. So it really begins with that conversation and reaching out to those communities and forming genuine, strong relationships with them. So this is a map of bioregions that I talked about. And if you could see sort of in the southern part of Alberta, where we are all situated in, that was the bioregion of the Plains people. And so that tells us the kind of food my ancestors ate, how we navigated through the seasons, very harsh winters, all of that kind of stuff, where we would spend our time, where the land that we stewarded. It's very different from Northwest Coast Indigenous people, where they would likely eat more food from, you know, the ocean and all that kind of stuff. Very different. So this bioregion tells you a lot about the original stewards of this land. Once you begin to take that deeper dive into all of this, more information becomes relevant, and you're thinking, okay, you know, where was I born? And if you truly want to start to decolonize your practice, the next time you're invited to a work function or a meeting and you're introducing yourself, try and find out the ancestral lands of where you were born or where you live and introduce yourself in that way. Give some power to that truth, because like I said, 100% of land in North America, like you could see on this map, is unoccupied land, is on ancestral traditional territories. It's important to understand the difference between this map and this map. So this map predates treaty agreements. So when we talk about ancestral lands, we're talking about the bioregion of these places. So the bioregion of Southern Alberta would be the traditional territories of the Six of Gates, that to be the Blackfoot Confederacy. Those Blackfoot speaking people that always resided on the Great Plains. And there's an elder in Tsuut'ina, Bruce Starlight, who tells a story about his people, the Dene speaking people. In Tsuut'ina, they speak the language of Dene. Bruce is one of the fewer fluent Dene speakers in Tsuut'ina Nation, and he tells us the story that his relatives come from, you know, Lakota Sioux tribes in the American Southwest and all this kind of stuff, that they migrated to where they're at right now. And similar stories are emerging, because we're an oral tradition. Similar stories are emerging from elders from Iahé Nakota and all this kind of stuff, so that we know after the ancestral lands, we come upon treaties, where in Treaty 7, after the Dene people found themselves where they're at, the Tsuut'ina people found themselves where they're at, and the Iahé Nakota people found themselves where they're at, that they became a part of this traditional territories. But it's just really important to know that there is a difference between ancestral lands and then later on treaty lands. And in Alberta, Alberta is comprised of 3 separate treaty areas. Southern Alberta being treaty number 7, towards the middle includes treaty number 6, and then more northern Alberta includes treaty number 8. So I believe that there are 45 distinct First Nations communities in Alberta alone. Treaty 7 was an agreement between Queen Victoria and tribes of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina and Iahé Nakota nations, on September 22nd, 1877. The agreement was signed at the Blackfoot crossing of the Bow River at the present-day Siksika Nation Reserve. Treaty 7 is one of 11 numbered treaties signed between First Nations and the Crown between 1871 and 1921. The treaty established a delimited area of land for the tribes or reserves. They were promised annual payments and or provisions from the Queen to the tribes and promised continued hunting and trapping rights on the tax surrendered. In exchange, the tribes ceded their rights to their traditional territories, of which they had earlier been recognized as the owners. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit. There's a common belief across the country that First Nations people ceded and surrendered our traditional territories, and that's not the case. We always entered into these treaty agreements and these conversations with the expectation that we were going to share the land and share resources. The English language wasn't our first language, and it was by manipulation a lot of times that the words and the language ceded and surrender were left out of those conversations. Bikani Elder Reg Croshoe tells us a story at the signing of Treaty Number 7 that it was a 3-day process. It was a 3-day ceremony because we always held things in ceremony. Like I said earlier, we're an oral tradition. And that we had no idea. And so this is an image of the museum at Blackfoot Crossing. So the museum is overlooking this valley. And in that valley, that's where tribes of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai were camped, as well as Tsuut'ina and I'ahinekota. And there was hundreds of our ancestors there that showed up for the signing of Treaty Number 7. And we were instructed to camp in this valleyway. What we didn't know was that the government of Canada had cannons set up on the hillsides surrounding this valley. And if they didn't get that Treaty Number 7 signed, that those cannons were going to be released onto that valley, causing, loss of life for many of our ancestors and our people. Now, this is oral tradition that's been passed down from generation to generation that still lives within the wisdom of elders like Reg Croshoe and Leroy Little Bear. They'll tell you the same similar story of the signing of that day. The Indian Act governs actually one more point on treaties, that these treaty agreements still exist today. They essentially tell the story about the responsibility that all treaty people have. And I would say that I'm not the only treaty person on this call, that everyone who is a participant, a treaty is an agreement between two groups of people. So I'm not the only treaty person here tonight. All of you, in fact, hold a level of responsibility and treaty. And this document still governs the relationship you have with First Nations communities. It's still a living document that is referred to a lot of times. There are court cases that are emerging for First Nations communities because of those promises that are indicated in those treaties were never fulfilled. Take, for instance, Calgary. Basically, in the treaty document, Indigenous leaders from the Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina and I'ahinekota, were manipulated to sign this. Little did they know that we were ceding 50,000 square kilometers of our land, of which now Calgary sits. We had no idea that that was going to happen. And then they forced us onto what we now know as reserves. We were forcibly put into confined areas. We were no longer able to travel with the seasons, travel with food. But they said, you know what, guys, we're going to take care of you. We're going to offer you cattle, farming equipment. We're going to make sure that you are healthy, that you're taken care of. And a lot of times that didn't happen. So the Blood Reserve just recently won a court case because they were offered cattle and farming equipment. And over years and years and years, since that treaty was signed, that equipment was never provided to us. So we won this court case called Cows and Plows that sort of was translated into what that would mean from a monetary standpoint in these contemporary times. And I know that the Blood Tribe is putting that money to good use. We are trying to correct the impacts of being forced on to reserve lands by, settler people that we had no control of. But now we are left with crises like opioid crises, homelessness, all of this kind of stuff these are the impacts when you confine a group of people and you just sort of try to hide them away from your world or try to assimilate them. These are the repercussions that we're experiencing now. So the Indian Act governs how the Canadian state interacts with First Nations bands. The Act sets out rules for how to govern First Nation bands and reserves. The Act was established in 1876. Interactions between First Nations people and enfranchised citizens were subject to strict controls. Under the Act, government authorities restricted the rights of First Nations people to practice their culture and traditions. Status First Nations people are still governed under the Indian Act to this day. The Indian Act still governs who I am as a status First Nations person. This Indian Act still governs my daughter, who is a status First Nations person. And through treaty agreements in the Indian Act, we were promised rations, and we were promised $5 per year. That didn't sort of take into consideration rates of inflation and all that kind of stuff. So I still receive $5 a year today. So does my daughter Charm, and any other Indigenous person who has status still receives all that kind of stuff because it was written into this legislation. So in Treaty 7, Treaty 7 is made up and comprised of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika translates to the Blackfoot Confederacy. And that includes the Kainai, Siksika, and Bikani, the Iahe Nakota, also known as Stony Nakota. Stony was a settler-imposed name given to that community based on their method of cooking with hot stones and rocks. But, you know, if that's the reasoning, we could all be referred to as Stony because the Blackfoot Confederacy also used the same methods. So does Tsuut'ina Nation, where we rely on the land for a lot of things, for cooking, for ceremony, all that kind of stuff. So the proper, appropriate name for the Nakota Nation is Iahe Nakota. That makes up Chiniki, Wesley, and Bearspaw. Then we have Tsuut'ina, and then Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. This is a map. These are sort of differentiating maps of Métis settlements and Métis regions in Alberta. I myself am not Métis. I am learning a lot about the Métis Nation and the roots of the Métis people. From what I know is that the Métis people are unique to Canada, unique to North America, and that historically it means people of mixed ancestry, of European and Indigenous ancestry. And there's so much more to learn about the Métis people, you know, of these lands. So what you're going to do is you're going to get a copy of these slides, and if you are compelled or if more questions are emerging for you around anything that I'm saying, then I hope that you're compelled to sort of do some self-directed learning after this, or reach out to me to get further clarification. So the Blackfoot Confederacy, or Nitsitapi, is the collective name of 3 First Nations band governments, the Siksika, Kainai, and North Pagan or Bikani. So when the border was created that separated the United States and Canada, it separated the northern southern Bikani nations. So we have Blackfoot speaking relatives in the United States. We refer to them as Mskapi Bikani. So the Blackfoot Confederacy essentially consists of 4 collective First Nation band governments, if we consider Mskapi Bikani our relatives south of the Medicine Line. And then we have Iahe Nakota Nation, which is 45 minutes west of Calgary. You'll drive right through the Nakota Nation if you ever go to Canmore or Banff. And yeah, the Nakota are related to the Dakota and Lakota nations of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, part of the larger Sioux Nation. Nakota meaning friend or ally. And the word Stony was given to them by white explorers because of their technique of using fire-heated rocks to boil broth in rawhide bowls. They're very closely related to the Assiniboine, who are also known as Stone Sioux. Alberta's Nakota First Nation comprises of 3 bands, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley, located on the Morley Reserve. Like I said, about 30 to 40 minutes west of Calgary. The Tsuut'ina are the Athabascan group, once part of the more northerly Deneze or Beaver Indians nations who migrated south onto the Great Plains in the 1700s. The Tsuut'ina are typically Northern Plains Indians. Their Sarsi language remains pure Athabascan to this day, and as such, it is closely related to the languages of the Dene groups of Northern Canada and Alaska, and to those of the Navajo and Apache peoples of the American Southwest. And then we have Métis Nation Region 3. So, you know, the Métis Nation of Alberta has 6 regional boards. They have branches that deal with unemployment, children's services, land agreements, and the rights of the Métis people as Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Southern Alberta is part of Métis Nation Region number 3. So, just going to, before I open it up for questions, I am going to show our first video. So just bear with me for a second here. There we go.
The strangers arrive and offer trade and friendship. The Indigenous population responds in kind. Gradually, the strangers begin to take up more and more space and make more and more requests from their hosts, until finally, they are not requesting at all. They are demanding. They are backing their demands with garrisoned outposts. As Indigenous peoples around the world have discovered, a deal is not a deal when it comes to settler governments.
I have approved pipelines that the previous government wasn't able to do.
Indigenous peoples from around the world recognize this process of slow, lawless confiscation of their land, with promises made and laws of protection enacted, then quickly broken. I want to stress that this is not at all ancient history. My people have been beaten, jailed, and shot at by the authorities simply for occupying our own lands. And it is the loss of our land that has been the precise cause of our impoverishment. Indigenous peoples control only 0.2% of the land in Canada, while settler governments claim control over the other 99.8%. With this distribution of land, you don't have to have a doctorate in economics to understand who will be poor and who will be rich, and our poverty is crushing. Our lives are 7 years shorter than the lives of non-Indigenous Canadians. Our unemployment rates are 4 times higher. The resources to educate our children are only a third of what is spent on non-Indigenous Canadian children. Our youth commit suicide at a more than 5 times higher rate, and we have been living this misery in Canada for 150 years. What has been the response of the Canadian government when we protest the illegal seizures of our lands and the intentional impoverishment of our people? Generally, it has been to simply turn away until our voices become too loud to ignore, then false promises and outright repression come into play. You cannot have reconciliation under the colonial 0.2% Indian Reserve System. It is impossible. The land issue must be addressed before reconciliation can begin. We are talking about fundamental change that recognizes our title to our territories.
Because you guys don't have permission to come across here. We could go back over there.
2017 marks the fact that we have been officially colonized by Canada for 150 years. Indigenous peoples and Canadians who believe in human rights need to look at Canada's 150th birthday as a period to undertake a commitment to decolonize Canada and recognize the right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination.
So I think I'm gonna pause there, Steve, and maybe see if there are some pressing questions before we take a 2-minute break.
Sure. We've got a couple of questions or comments here in the Q&A from Christine Rennell. She says, I've enrolled in the University of Alberta Indigenous Canada course. It's free. Have you seen this or know about it? And if so, what are your thoughts on the content?
Yeah, I've definitely heard about it. I've heard really good things about the University of Alberta online course. I haven't taken it myself. I hope to soon. I would just say and encourage all those who are taking any sort of online course to reflect on the diversity of our nations, even within Treaty 7, that there's diversity within our languages, all that kind of stuff. So just be mindful of that. And even with those online courses, it's the same with knowledge extraction and knowledge mobilization, that I hope you're not attending these online courses only with the motivation to increase your understanding and being more extractive, that you're actually doing something with that knowledge that you're gaining. And I know Christine, and I know the spaces that she's a part of. And so I know that you're mobilizing a lot of the stuff that you are learning.
Okay, great. Another question from Christine. Have you or those who produced this received any backlash for the film? I guess the film was just shown. Have you had any backlash from that film?
I haven't. I mean, this is a part of the bravery that I was talking about. This is the part of the truth setting. My intention, Christine, and for everyone on this call, is not to talk about pipelines. I'm not trying to be political here. I'm not trying to surface feelings of anger or guilt or anything. But the message that I want you to read into the message of what has the fight that we are engaged in when it comes to what little land we have to this date. I strongly believe there are ways we can coexist as settler communities and Indigenous communities, but there's still a level of misunderstanding when it comes to our histories. And so for me, that clip more than anything talks about that untold story, that history of Canada that's missing far too often from these spaces.
Okay, great. Another question from Valerie Ushinsky. What does self-determination mean?
It can mean many things. I think it depends on the context of how you're using it. For Indigenous people, there's an Indian Act that governs who we are, what we can and can't do on and off reserve. We can't own businesses. There's legislation that imposes itself on who we are as status First Nations people. There's no self-determination in this day and age with the existence of the Indian Act and how treaty agreements have been violated by settler governments and settler people, and the fact that most people, you probably don't even know your responsibility in those treaties. And that's hard to do. That's hard to be determined in that
Okay.
sense.
Super. Another question, Bula Ghosh. I agree with land settlement. Without land settlement, we cannot have reconciliation. How do you think we can start on a fair settlement of the land?
I think we just need to honor and uphold the land that exists now for reserve lands. It's not being respected. There's power and control from larger systems and governments who just, at the change of a law can sort of impose themselves on what we can and can't do on that land. So it just needs to be respected. The agreements that we have in place right now, it just needs to be respected and supported. I think the government is quick to respond to crises in mainstream society. Can you imagine if Calgary or any one of your communities was without clean drinking water, and the response that would come with for the federal government? That's happening right now in real time for First Nations communities, but we're not getting the support that we need to get clean drinking water to our community members. That's the first question that I ask my parents every time I go to the Blood Reserve to visit. Do you guys need water? And then I'll pick up water every time I go down there. So it's a real thing.
Okay, good. This is from Bill Fitzsimons. could you describe the traditional use of land agreements and then talk about the contemporary meaning or significance? Or the traditional use of land acknowledgement, I guess, is what he's asking. And then talk about the contemporary meaning or significance. Now, I don't know if you're addressing that later in your presentation about more about the land acknowledgement.
I think it's a big question, Bill, and it might surface in the second part of our time together. So let's hold off on that. And if I can't, then, you know, that's an invitation for you to reach out to elders from the community who I'm sure would have a lot more knowledge in that area than I would.
Okay, great. Mary Turner asks, how can we create strong relationships with our Indigenous neighbors?
Well, I think Steve's a good person to talk to about that. Steve has really strong relationships with many of my relatives, and I don't know, Steve, how did you come upon those relationships, and how are you mobilizing that? I know what I would do. I would simply reach out and say, introduce myself. This is who I am. It's hard for me to answer because I'm put in a professional position where I have 1 foot in my traditional ancestry and 1 foot in this mainstream ancestry. So it sort of comes with that territory. A lot of settler folks, I would say put yourself in spaces where you are the minority. I'm always constantly in spaces where I am the minority. I'm in a lot of white spaces. So put yourself in spaces where you're the minority and there's the majority of Indigenous people around, and begin to build relationships that way.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Tim, as many of you know, maybe you don't, but I grew up 3 miles from the Blood Indian Reserve. So I went to school with a lot of Indigenous in Glenwood and Cardston. So that was the beginning of it. And then I was away for a lot of my employment, but coming back and being with Rotary, we just really felt there was a need to get to know our neighbors out on the Blood Reserve. So about 3 years ago, we started in the school system. We started with the homeless shelters. Now we're working with the tribe council on perhaps putting an outdoor recreation facility. So it's just getting to know the people, I think, like you said, Tim. And yeah, when I go out there, I'm the minority. I'm about the only white person, right? So, but I like it. It's neat to do that. So that's, I think, the big key.
And the thing is about that too, Steve. You're the minority, but you're sort of like welcomed into that space.
Oh, yeah.
You're welcomed with open arms and with, you know, this attitude of friendship. I feel like people really fear being in that minority space, but you have to know that you have a place in this conversation. A value for Indigenous people is all about generosity and kindness. The mainstream society has painted a really bad picture of who we are as barbaric and uncivilized. But that ideology came from your ancestor, John A. Macdonald, who, you know, used those words that we are barbaric and uncivilized, and that thought pattern still exists today. And so just know that you are welcomed in these communities and these spaces. So this is a typical land acknowledgement that we would see today. I think this is even the Cowrie Foundation's land acknowledgement. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai Piikani, as well as the Iahe Nakota and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play and help us steward this land, honor, and celebrate this territory. This sacred gathering place provides us with an opportunity to engage in and demonstrate leadership on reconciliation. Okay, what's going on here? Sorry. This is sort of a formula, if you would, a model of how we see the path of acknowledgement of land. So reconciliation is a journey and should live within all sectors of society and in many ways. I don't know if all of you were able to watch the clip from Jessica Bolduc on allies and edgewalkers, but she talks a lot about this, that we are all on uneven ground when it comes to understanding. And we're sort of at this phase where we are planting these trees of reconciliation, these seeds of growth. And so I scanned through a lot of your questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and it's just like, bam, 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 bam. It's coming at, these arrows are coming at me in the form of your questions. And it's overwhelming because I don't necessarily have the answers that you're seeking, because I'm not at that level of understanding quite yet. This work is so new. That being said, I think that they're great questions and that the answers do exist. And those answers could be your guiding path to strengthening relationships with elders who hold that knowledge in a lot of those questions. And then we go to acknowledging land as part of a change process and an act of reconciliation. To create understanding, acknowledging land builds upon community and honors the authentic history of Turtle Island, or Mother Earth, and the original people. But before all of that, context needs to be considered by all those also incorporating change process into their practice. This context is what I briefly shared with you in the first half of this presentation. That context lies within the words of the narrator from that YouTube clip. That's context. That's context that has to be understood, has to be reconciled with. It's a hard thing to hear sometimes, this truth. Understand that I know that it's challenging, because it's challenging for me as well to facilitate that conversation and to bring and surface that truth to spaces like this. It's not an easy thing for me to do, especially to an audience of Rotarians. It's very intimidating, I gotta say, but it's needed. That context is absolutely needed. Let's see if this video works.
What is land acknowledgement?
Those of us that are continuing our oral history are blessed. What we shared, that was told from way back. Many, many years ago, my great uncle asked my grandfather, "How long have we been here?" He relayed a story about carrying a way of life as Nitsuttapi, the Blackfoot speaking people. The prairie region was dominated by the prairie grizzly bear. The prairie grizzly bear said, "You have to make treaty with everything in this prairie land. The animals, the birds, the fish, the water, the hills, the rocks. They all live in beings." He said, "I will move to the southern region." And so they became Sokitsutapi, the people of the plains, of the open country.
We were part of the ecosystem. We were not masters of it. The buffalo and the moose and the elk and the antelope and the deer and the grass and the trees were more than us.
Well, we were raised to believe that everything has a spirit, and that everything around us is alive and has a purpose.
We praise Creator, giver of life. We give thanks to Mother Earth.
You know, after we grow up from our biological mothers, the earth becomes our caregiver. Everything that we need is there.
And we're supposed to honor the Creator with all our life. And we're supposed to look after the gift of the land that He gave us to live on.
For us, the land tells us the story. I mean, it's just story after story. Oh, this happened here, this happened here, this happened over here.
The story is Napi, the old man standing with his bow and his elbows on this side.
And that was how our warriors pictured the landscape.
All the tributaries run into the bow. It's the mother of all water that flows through. The people came there, they asked, "What's the name of this river?" They said, "We cut our bow from the choke cherry trees. They're strong and powerful. We named this river the Bow, Namakta."
I was born and raised in a road allowance, a strip of land that the farmers didn't want and the government didn't have no use for. Metis were just out on their own. We didn't belong anywhere. In Treaty 7 territory, I'm accepted, I'm something, and I'm with my people.
Because you're in the territory of your ancestors, no, this is home. Something that we pass on to our children and to our grandchildren.
This land has to be acknowledged. The people that took care of this land for a long time have to be acknowledged. You know, at least find the truth about us.
I'm a residential school survivor, but it's up to me to have courage and go back and learn the ways of my people. The elders will say, I pray that the young people will not forget the Creator. The true acknowledgement of the land every day.
We honor our ancestors by acknowledging Treaty 7 territory. We acknowledge the Treaty 7 nations, the Piikani First Nation, the Siksika First Nation, the Gana First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. We acknowledge the ancestral territory of the Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the home of Métis Region number 3.
So, you know, why does all of this matter? Because, you know, it's a part of a larger narrative, like I said, and I've been saying this, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's a part of that larger context that's missing a lot from these spaces. And there's, like I said in the beginning, there is this emerging interest from a lot of people in a lot of sectors to try to find ways and novel solutions to mobilize the work of reconciliation or to do land acknowledgements. But it requires a lot more work before that can happen. And a lot more work in understanding and being okay to surface some of this really hard truth narrative that is emerging. I'm gonna share one more video clip before we open it up for more discussion and questions. And then we will go from there.
Many people have said over the years that I've been involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all of the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all of your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all of those headstones that you put up for all of your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but it's part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people.
So, you know, at the very core of it all, I know that there is a lot of work we have to do. And I know when I'm coming to terms with the fact that I may not see or experience the fruits of reconciliation in my lifetime, and that's okay for me, because I'm coming to understand and I'm coming to terms with this work being very generational. What does motivate me is reflecting on my time growing up on the Blood Reserve, going to school in a urban center, in a white-dominated school, and moving through life within my own skin color and being treated very poorly by mainstream society. So what motivates me is the fact that it is generational, and that this conversation is happening a lot more these days. The reason why that motivates me is because I have a young child in my life who I am preparing for this world. She is going to become an Indigenous woman one day, and that's both terrifying and exciting. And I think if you're a parent, you're going to relate to this, that we only want the best for our children. And we do our best to prepare them for the challenges that they might face in this world. But for Indigenous people raising children, especially young girls, we're preparing them to survive. We're preparing them so that they don't become one of the thousands upon thousands of missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls and not being prioritized. These are the things that we think about. And this is tough. Don't get me wrong. I know that this is tough, but I know that generationally, we have a lot of work to do for this truth-telling movement. And if you are sitting there in levels of discomfort, or you're sitting there in increased levels of understanding, and there's elements of what I said and shared tonight that are resonating with you or are compelling you to dig a little bit deeper, then I would just try to encourage you to continue that. We generationally have a lot of work to do to embed a lot of this truth-telling into the fabric of society, so that my daughter's understood by your children and your grandchildren, because right now she's not. The way she's understood is misunderstood in very challenging, discriminatory ways that I was exposed to growing up, and I'm still exposed to as a professional, as a working professional. I still experience that. One of my greatest fears for my daughter was to face racism in school. That happened 2 years ago at a school she's attending. So it's still with us. It's still alive and well. But I think we have a collective responsibility to begin to shape a new narrative for this younger generation that's coming up, where they will be faced with the challenges of reconciliation. So I'll end there and maybe open it up for more questions, Steve, and that'll be my time.
Well, right off the bat, Tim, I want to thank you for being so open with us. As you said, it's not easy, and you're amongst all these Caucasians, and yet we do feel we are friends, and we want to use this knowledge to enable us to go forward and to act, not just to, as you say, just to learn and not do anything. So that's a great way to approach it. But anyway, there's two or three questions concerning the Indian Act, and sort of like one person said it was tried during Elliott Trudeau's time to change that act. It didn't go through. So is there things happening now, or one person even says, can we be an ally in repealing the Indian Act? What is happening with that act?
There's a couple of documents that I want to refer to. The first one is a report similar to the Truth and Reconciliation report that was released in 1996, and it's called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples Report. And the Rcap, so Rcap took a similar process to TRC where they consulted with First Nations people. They laid out a plan for Canada to begin to explore and sort of dismantle or get rid of the Indian Act. Now, 1996, that's when that report was released. I don't know if you know of the blanket exercise, but the blanket exercise emerged from the Rcap report, because in that Rcap report, it called for the development of further education on Canada's history from an Indigenous perspective. Kairos saw that and convened with Indigenous communities, and they developed this really impactful blanket exercise that we facilitate as well. So I would ask you to read the Rcap report. It's a document that I refer to a lot of the times. In short, we laid out a plan. Indigenous communities laid out a plan to sort of try to get rid of the stipulations of the Indian Act or the Indian Act altogether. But that has never been enacted by our current government state. That's why it's generational. We need a new level of leadership who is open to significantly changing and shifting for the benefit of all, is what I would say to that.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions here I'll try to put together. What advice do you have for Rotary to embark on the reconciliation journey? And along with that, can you provide a list of resources for those of us who want to learn more? So kind of, how can we embark as Rotarians, and where can we learn more as far as resources?
I think the resources are out there. I would ask you to take on some of the labor of seeking them out. Everything I've put together, everything we design, I have found easily accessible online. I've put in the labor to do that. So the information is out there. You just got to sort of use that Google search to dig a little bit deeper, because it exists and it's very accessible. I would say as Rotary that you continue this conversation, that you continue to encourage your members to go through self-directed learning. At the Calgary Foundation, it has become embedded into some of our processes, like our staff performance development. So the way our staff are evaluated year after year, there's an element of reconciliation that they have to identify. They have to identify something that they're going to do in the year ahead that helps to strengthen their relationships with Indigenous communities, or embarks on levels of learning for reconciliation and decolonization, and their performance is measured on one of those goals as well. So there are ways you could sort of embed it into the structures of your systems, similar to what we're doing at the foundation here.
Okay, great. Now, before I go on, Rick, you said you had 2 or 3 from the chat, so why don't we turn over there, and then we'll just see if there's any time after you're done before we end.
Thanks, Steve. Tim, Bill Skinner has indicated he has recently purchased the Atlas of Indigenous Peoples of Canada. He would like to know, do you consider it to be a fair effort to help explain part of the issues of Indigenous history and culture?
Yes, along with many other resources that also exist.
So that is definitely one that one should, if they want to learn more, that's one they should go to, amongst others.
It's a good resource, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. Sarah Imran would like to know, is there a vision of unsettled Canada, and what does it entail?
I think it entails a complete understanding and awareness of all of this hard history that I'm surfacing in just a brief past 60 minutes that I was holding on to. A lot of what I have shared with you is not understood by many Canadians, there are high school students who are still complaining that they have to learn so much about Indigenous history and all this kind of stuff until that attitude shifts, until these attitudes and these beliefs shift. And we are welcoming this knowledge and it's fully understood and we're okay to do that. That's when I think we can sort of sit back and talk about, yeah, I think it's making a difference and it's having a shift. But until then, we have lots of work to do.
Thank you. I think that's it for me, Steve.
Okay, I'll just throw out another question here from Christine Rendell. The education system, has it evolved into the real history at all in recent years through our education system?
I don't think so. I don't think to the degree that it needs to be at. I think the education system plays a huge role in a lot of this, and there are entities like, you know, the government of Alberta who is interrupting a lot of that stuff when they publicly, you know, go against doing land acknowledgements. When they do that kind of stuff, it's these systems like the education system is the only system that has yet to change from colonial ways of how we are educated. And that remains true for, you know, even my daughter who's attending all that kind of stuff. So no, I don't think that they have done enough yet.
Okay, thank you. So Tim, in summary, I just want to read a comment. You'll probably see it, but just so everyone sees it, I think it's a good way to summarize what you've done for us tonight. But it's from Sonella Jerkova. She says, thank you for your powerful message and for generously sharing your knowledge, your ancestral history, your genuine journey. We feel obligated to learn more, acknowledge the territory, and pass to our children and grandchildren how welcome we are on this land. Thank you, Tim. So I would echo that. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Tim, I'm going to wrap up for the evening, but I will leave you with the closing comment. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm with you on this journey. That's a personal statement. Many of us have a deep interest. We lack knowledge. Maybe our heart is in the right place. We just need our knowledge to catch up. So thank you for being our teacher tonight. I know you'd never call yourself an elder just yet, but you're teaching me. And thank you very much, Tim. I appreciate it. So back to you to close out your closing comments.
Awesome. No real closing comments, just speaking from the heart that, yeah, just thank you for inviting me into the space. I know a lot of the things that I touch on are very touchy. They are somewhat controversial, but I come with them. I come with truth with care. I hope you know that first and foremost. And that I do strongly believe that there is hope for a reconciled world where we can coexist, where my daughter, like I said, is fully understood by your children and your grandchildren, that's the impact. That's sort of the end goal that I'm working towards, is that generational work. So just thank you guys for inviting me into this space. And I really hope that the conversations continue and that the work continues.